An outcast is only invisible until the wrong king decides to see her. The marble floor was cold beneath Elena Whitmore's palms, its polished surface reflecting the fractured glow of 1,000 candle flames above her, each flicker a reminder that she did not belong among them. Laughter echoed through the grand hall, soft at first, then sharper, like glass tapping against glass, as nobles in silken gowns and tailored coats turned their eyes toward her kneeling form. The scent of pine smoke and aged wine filled the air, rich and suffocating, pressing against her lungs with every shallow breath she dared to take. She kept her gaze lowered, not out of obedience, but because meeting their eyes would only give them more reason to speak her name like a flaw. "Look at her," someone whispered, not quietly enough. The pack's mistake dragged into the king's sight. The words landed heavier than they should have, sinking into her chest where years of silence had already carved space for them. Elena's fingers curled slightly against the stone, steadying herself, grounding her in something real as the world above her seemed to tilt. She had learned long ago that dignity, for someone like her, was not given. It was something you held on to in silence, even when everything else was stripped away. A pair of polished boots stepped into her line of sight, stopping just inches from her hand. She didn't look up. She didn't need to. The weight of expectation in the room shifted, thickened, as if everyone leaned in at once, waiting. "You were told to stay in the shadows," the man said, his voice smooth but edged with quiet disdain. "And yet here you are, kneeling where queens are chosen." A ripple of amusement passed through the crowd. Elena swallowed, her throat dry, but said nothing. Words had never saved her before. A faint tremor passed through her hands, quickly stilled as she drew in a slow breath, counting it the way she always did when the pressure built too high. 1, 2, 3. The noise around her faded just enough for her to hear something else. A soft whimper, barely audible beneath the music and murmurs, but unmistakable. Her head tilted ever so slightly, her senses reaching beyond the cruelty, beyond the heat of judgment, until she found it. A small shape near the edge of the hall, half hidden behind a column, trembling. No one else noticed. No one cared. Of course they didn't. Carefully, slowly, Elena shifted her weight, her body moving with the quiet instinct of someone used to going unseen. Her eyes flickered toward the sound, just for a second, and in that moment, something inside her changed. Not louder, not stronger, just certain. She pushed herself up from the floor, ignoring the startled murmurs that followed, and took a single step away from the center of humiliation, toward the forgotten corner where something fragile waited. And somewhere above them all, unseen but not unaware, a presence stilled. Watching, waiting. Elena's steps were light, almost soundless against the vast marble floor, yet every movement seemed to echo in the charged silence that followed her defiance. The laughter did not stop, but it shifted, turning uncertain, curious, as though the room itself could not decide whether to mock her further or simply watch what would happen next. She felt their eyes on her back, sharp and pressing, but she did not turn around. She had spent years learning how to endure being seen. Tonight, for the first time, she chose where to look. The small shape near the column trembled again, a soft, fragile sound that tightened something deep in her chest. As she drew closer, the glow of the chandeliers revealed a tiny wolf pup curled against the base of the stone, its pale fur dulled by dust, its sides rising and falling in shallow breaths. It did not belong here among silk and silver. It did not belong to the laughter. Elena lowered herself slowly, careful not to startle it, her hands hovering for a moment before she let them settle gently against its side. Warmth spread beneath her palms, faint but steady, and she exhaled a breath she had not realized she was holding. "It is all right," she whispered, her voice barely more than air. "You are safe." The words were not meant for the crowd behind her, yet the sudden quiet suggested they had heard them anyway. A murmur rippled through the hall, confusion replacing amusement. "What is she doing?" someone asked. "That creature should not be here." Another voice, colder, sharper, answered, "She should not be here either." Elena ignored them. Her focus remained on the small life beneath her hands, on the fragile rhythm she could feel, on the quiet instinct that guided her movements. She brushed her fingers carefully along the pup's fur, untangling the dust, smoothing the uneven strands, as though restoring something the world had overlooked. The pup shifted slightly, its eyes fluttering open just enough to meet hers, and for a fleeting second, the noise of the hall faded completely. There was only that moment, that connection, something unspoken, but unmistakable. Then the air changed. It was subtle at first, like the faint drop in temperature before a storm, but it spread quickly, silencing conversations mid-sentence, stilling movement, drawing every gaze toward the center of the hall. Elena felt it before she saw anything, a presence that pressed against her senses, not harsh, not cruel, but absolute. Authority that did not need to announce itself. Slowly, instinctively, she lifted her head. Across the room, the crowd had parted without command, forming a clear path through the sea of velvet and gold. At the far end, beneath the highest arch of the hall, a figure stood motionless, as though carved from shadow and light. He had not been there before. Or perhaps he had, and no one had dared to notice. The weight of his gaze reached her before she could fully meet it, steady and unyielding, settling over her like something inevitable. Elena's breath caught, not in fear, but in recognition of something she could not name. Around her, the nobles lowered their heads, one by one, the shift in power unmistakable. No one laughed now. No one spoke. And in the silence, Elena remained where she was, kneeling beside the forgotten, her hands still resting against the small, fragile life she refused to abandon, even as the world itself seemed to hold its breath. No one told Elena to rise, and yet the silence that settled over the hall felt heavier than any command she had ever obeyed. The small wolf pup shifted faintly beneath her hands, its breathing a fragile rhythm that grounded her in a moment that no longer belonged to the crowd behind her. She could feel it now, clearer than before, the presence that had entered the room without sound but had stolen every ounce of attention. It was not loud. It did not need to be. It simply existed, and everything else adjusted around it. Elena slowly lifted her gaze, her eyes finding him at last. King Lucian Blackthorn did not move as others did. He did not shift his weight, did not glance around to measure reactions, did not acknowledge the bowed heads that lined his path. He stood with a stillness that made the air itself feel deliberate, as though time had chosen to slow in his presence. His dark coat fell in clean lines to the floor, shadow meeting stone, and the faint light above traced the edges of his figure like something carved rather than living. But it was his eyes that held her. Silver, unmistakable, steady in a way that felt both distant and impossibly close. Elena felt the pull of it, not as force, but as gravity, something quiet and undeniable. Around her, the nobles remained frozen in place, waiting for something to happen, for someone to speak, for the moment to resolve into something familiar. It did not. Instead, the king took a single step forward. The sound was soft, measured, but it carried through the hall as though it had been struck against stone. Another step followed, and the distance between them began to close, slowly, deliberately, until the space that had once separated power from insignificance no longer felt so absolute. Elena did not move. She could not out of fear, but because something deeper held her still, the same instinct that had drawn her toward the small creature at her side. The wolf pup stirred again, its eyes opening wider this time, a faint glimmer of awareness flickering within them. Its gaze shifted past her, toward the approaching figure, and for the briefest moment, something changed in its expression. Recognition. The word formed in Elena's mind before she could stop it, though she had no reason to understand it. A murmur threatened to rise from the crowd, but it died before it could take shape as the king came to a stop just a few feet away, close enough now that she could see the subtle rise and fall of his breath, the calm precision of it, as if even that was controlled. Close enough that the weight of his attention settled fully on her, no longer distant, no longer shared. "You moved," he said, his voice low, even, carrying without effort. It was not a question. Elena swallowed, the sound almost too loud in the quiet. "It needed help," she answered, her voice softer, but steady. She did not look away. For a moment that stretched longer than it should have, nothing else existed. Not the hall, not the watching eyes, not the expectations that had shaped her life until now. Only the space between them, and the fragile life resting beneath her hands. Then, slowly, something shifted in the king's expression. Not a smile. Not approval. Something quieter. Something that did not belong to the room they stood in. And when he spoke again, the words did not belong to the court either. So did you. The words settled into the silence with a weight that did not need to be raised to be felt, and Elena felt something inside her chest tighten in a way she did not understand. No one had ever spoken to her like that before, not without expectation, not without judgment hidden beneath the surface. She did not know how to answer, so she did not try. Her hands remained steady against the small wolf pup, her focus grounded in the gentle rise and fall beneath her palms, even as the air around her seemed to shift again, subtly, as though the world itself had taken a breath it had been holding for far too long. The king's gaze did not leave her, but it softened in a way that was almost imperceptible, a quiet change that only someone standing this close could notice. Then, without warning, he moved. Not away, not past her, but down. The motion was smooth, controlled, deliberate as he lowered himself to one knee on the cold marble floor beside her. The sound alone sent a ripple through the hall, a collective intake of breath that broke the silence at last. No one spoke. No one dared. Elena's eyes widened slightly, her breath catching as she watched him, unable to reconcile what she was seeing with everything she had been taught about power, about distance, about the unspoken rules that govern this place. Kings did not kneel. Not here. Not like this. And certainly not beside someone like her. His hand moved slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, but she did not. She could not. His fingers hovered just above the wolf pup before gently resting against its fur, careful, measured, as though he understood exactly how fragile it was. The small creature stirred at his touch, its body relaxing in a way it had not before, as if recognizing something essential, something that did not need to be explained. Elena felt the shift through her own hands, the warmth deepening, steadying, and for a moment, she forgot about the crowd entirely. You saw what others ignored, he said quietly, his voice meant for her alone, though the stillness of the room carried every word. You chose to act when it was easier to remain still. Elena swallowed, her gaze dropping briefly to the space where their hands nearly touched, separated by only the smallest distance. It was not a choice, she said softly. It was the only thing that felt right. The king regarded her for a long moment, something thoughtful moving behind his steady expression. Around them, the tension in the room began to shift into something else, something uncertain, as if the foundations of what everyone believed were beginning to crack, quietly, without sound. A figure near the edge of the hall shifted, stepping forward as though to interrupt, but the movement stopped the moment the king's attention flickered in that direction. It was not a harsh look. It did not need to be. It was enough. The message was clear. No one would interfere. Elena felt it then, not as fear, but as a strange, unfamiliar sense of space opening around her, as though for the first time, she was not being pressed into the shape others had decided for her. The king turned back to her, his focus unwavering, and when he spoke again, his voice carried something new, something that settled deeper than before. Then perhaps, he said, it is time the world learns from what you see. The silence did not break, but it changed, stretching into something fragile, something that could shatter with the smallest misstep, and Elena felt it in the way every breath in the room seemed to hesitate before being taken. The king remained beside her, still kneeling, his presence no longer distant or untouchable, but anchored in the same space she occupied, and that alone unsettled the careful balance the court had always maintained. The small wolf pup shifted again beneath their hands, its breathing stronger now, more certain, as though whatever unseen weight had pressed against it before was slowly lifting. Elena let her fingers move gently along its side, following the rhythm, grounding herself in something simple and real, because everything else around her had become too uncertain to trust. A voice finally broke through the quiet, controlled but edged with disbelief. Your Majesty. It began, careful, measured, but unable to hide the tension beneath it. Surely this is unnecessary. The creature can be removed, and the situation corrected. The hesitation before the last word lingered longer than it should have, drawing a faint shift in the air, as though even language itself had become dangerous. Elena felt the attention turn again, not toward her alone this time, but toward the king, waiting, watching, measuring what he would do. For a brief moment, nothing happened. Then Lucian Blackthorn rose. The movement was unhurried, fluid, but it carried with it a quiet finality, as though something had already been decided long before this moment. He did not look at the speaker immediately. Instead, his gaze returned to the small wolf pup, his hand lingering there for just a second longer before he withdrew it, allowing the space to settle once more. Only then did he turn. The shift in his attention was enough. It moved through the room like a current, subtle but undeniable, and the man who had spoken lowered his head slightly, the confidence in his posture faltering in a way that did not go unnoticed. "You believe this is a situation to be corrected," the king said, his voice even, carrying without effort, each word landing with quiet precision. It was not a question. The man hesitated, just long enough to reveal the uncertainty he had tried to conceal. "I believe," he said carefully, "that order must be maintained." A faint murmur of agreement rippled through the edges of the crowd, quickly stilled as the king's presence pressed down once more. Elena remained where she was, her hands still resting on the wolf pup, but her attention shifted, drawn by the exchange, by the way the air seemed to tighten with every word. She had heard this before, in different forms, in quieter rooms, in harsher tones. Order. It had always meant the same thing. Not fairness, not truth, just the preservation of what already existed. The king regarded the man for a long moment, his expression unreadable, and then, slowly, he stepped forward, not toward the center of the hall, not back to the place prepared for him, but closer to Elena. The movement alone was enough to send another wave of tension through the room, sharper this time, edged with something closer to disbelief. When he spoke again, his voice carried something different, something that settled deeper than authority alone. "Order without understanding is nothing more than habit," he said. "And habit is not law." The words did not rise. They did not need to. They settled into the room, into the silence, into the spaces where assumptions had lived unquestioned for far too long. Elena felt something shift again, not around her this time, but within her, a quiet awareness that something was changing, not just in the room, but in the way she was being seen. The king's gaze returned to her, steady, deliberate, and for the first time, it did not feel like she was being measured. It felt like she was being recognized, and that, more than anything else, made the room hold its breath once again. The stillness did not fade, but it deepened, settling into the bones of the hall like something ancient and unyielding, and Elena could feel it in the quiet rhythm of her own breathing, slower now, steadier, as if the world around her had shifted just enough to let her exist within it without resistance. The wolf pup beneath her hands let out a soft, almost contented exhale, its small body no longer trembling but resting, as though it had found something it had been searching for without knowing it. Elena's fingers moved gently through its fur, instinct guiding her in ways she had never been taught, her touch careful and certain, as if she understood exactly how to hold something fragile without breaking it. Across from her, the king remained still, but there was a change in the way he stood now, a subtle difference in the set of his shoulders, in the quiet focus of his gaze, as though something he had been observing from a distance was no longer distant at all. The crowd had not recovered. They lingered in that suspended moment, uncertain, watching, waiting for the shape of what was happening to reveal itself in a way they could understand, but nothing about this fit into what they knew. A low voice rose again from the edge of the hall, more cautious this time, but still pressing against the silence. "Your Majesty," it said, softer, as though the speaker had learned from the last interruption. "There are expectations for tonight. The ceremony cannot proceed if—" The words faltered, trailing off under the weight of the king's quiet attention. Elena did not look at the speaker. She did not need to. She could feel the tension gathering again, not sharp like before, but heavy, layered with something deeper than simple disagreement. Expectation. It had always been the rule that guided everything here, shaping actions, defining worth, deciding who mattered and who did not. She had lived her entire life beneath it, molded by it, diminished by it. The king took a slow breath, the movement almost imperceptible, and then he stepped closer again, closing the last small distance between them. Elena felt it immediately, not as pressure, but as presence, something steady and unyielding that did not ask her to move, did not demand that she change, only existed beside her as if that had always been its place. He looked down at the wolf pup, his expression unreadable for a moment longer, and then his gaze lifted, not to the nobles, not to the court, but to the space above them all, as though he were addressing something beyond the room itself. When he spoke, his voice carried farther this time, reaching every corner of the hall with quiet clarity. What you call expectation, he said, is nothing more than repetition. The words settled slowly, deliberately, each one leaving a mark in the silence it followed. And repetition, without question, becomes blindness. A faint shift moved through the crowd, not loud, not overt, but present, like the first ripple across still water. Elena felt it, the subtle change in the way the room held her, no longer as something to be dismissed, but as something that could not be ignored. The king's gaze returned to her once more, and this time, there was no distance left in it, no barrier of rank or rule. Only recognition, only certainty. He extended his hand, not in command, not in demand, but in invitation, his palm open, steady, waiting. The gesture was simple. It should not have mattered. And yet, in a room built on power and distance, it felt like the beginning of something no one there had ever seen before. Elena stared at his hand, the space between them impossibly small, and yet heavier than anything she had ever faced, her breath catching in her chest as the world seemed to narrow to that single moment, that single choice. And for the first time in her life, no one told her what to do next. The wolf pup shifted gently against her palm, its warmth steady, grounding, as if reminding her that not everything fragile had to remain hidden, not everything overlooked had to stay that way. Around them, the court remained frozen, their silence no longer filled with judgment, but with something uncertain, something that trembled on the edge of disbelief. Kings did not offer their hands to outcasts. Not like this. Not where everyone could see. Elena's fingers twitched slightly against the soft fur beneath them, her instincts pulling in two directions at once. One shaped by years of being told to stay small, to stay invisible, to never reach beyond what was allowed, and the other quieter, deeper, something that had guided her all along without her ever naming it. Slowly, carefully, she lifted her hand from the wolf pup, the absence of its warmth immediate, but not empty, not anymore. Her gaze rose to meet his fully, and for a moment, the weight of his presence did not feel overwhelming. It felt steady, certain, real. She placed her hand in his. The contact was gentle, deliberate, his grip firm without pressure, as though he understood exactly how much strength was needed and no more. A subtle shift passed through the air, almost imperceptible, but it carried through the hall like a ripple across still water, touching every corner, every watching eye. Elena felt it move through her as well, not as force, but as clarity, as if something long buried had been acknowledged at last. The king did not release her hand. Instead, he stepped back slightly, drawing her with him, not pulling, not commanding, simply allowing the movement to happen as though it had always been meant to. She rose to her feet, the motion unsteady at first, her body adjusting to the unfamiliar balance of standing beside him rather than beneath the weight of everyone else. The difference was immediate. The space around her changed, widened, no longer pressing in but opening outward, as though the boundaries that had defined her place had been quietly removed. A soft murmur broke from the crowd despite their efforts to remain silent, disbelief threading through the sound as they watched the distance between king and outcast disappear in a way none of them could deny. Elena felt their attention again, but it no longer felt the same. It no longer carried the same sharp edges. It was something else now, something uncertain, something questioning. The king turned slightly, positioning himself not in front of her, not shielding her completely, but standing at her side, his presence a constant, unyielding line that redefined the space they occupied together. His voice carried once more, calm, unwavering, leaving no room for interpretation. "You have called her outcast," he said, his gaze sweeping across the gathered nobles, each word landing with quiet precision. "You have defined her by what you believe she lacks." The silence deepened, heavy, expectant. Elena stood still beside him, her hand still in his, her heartbeat steady despite everything, because something inside her had settled, something that no longer needed to hide. The king's grip tightened just slightly, not to hold her in place, but to anchor the moment, to make it undeniable. Tonight, he continued, his voice carrying through the hall with a certainty that could not be questioned, you will learn what you failed to see. And for the first time, Elena did not feel like she was standing alone in a room that had never wanted her there. She felt like the center of something that was only just beginning to reveal itself. The words did not fade when he finished speaking. They settled, anchoring themselves into the very foundation of the hall, and Elena felt the shift ripple outward, not just through the crowd, but through herself, steady and undeniable. The king's hand remained in hers, not as a restraint, but as a quiet declaration, and for the first time, the contact did not feel foreign. It felt certain. Around them, the nobles stood frozen in a silence that no longer belonged to arrogance or dismissal, but to something far more fragile, something uncertain that had not yet found its voice. The wolf pup at Elena's feet let out a soft sound, drawing her attention downward for a brief moment, and she saw it now with clearer eyes. Its fur, once dulled by neglect, seemed to catch the light differently, faint strands of silver woven through pale white, subtle but unmistakable. Its gaze lifted toward the king, and there was no fear in it, only recognition, quiet and absolute. Elena's breath slowed as the realization began to take shape, not fully formed, but enough to stir something deeper within her understanding. This was not just a creature overlooked. This was something more. The king released her hand then, but the absence did not feel like loss. It felt like transition. He stepped forward, placing himself just ahead of her, not to separate her from the room, but to bring her with him into its center, where every eye could see, where every assumption could no longer remain hidden behind distance. The movement drew a subtle reaction from the crowd, a shifting of weight, a tightening of breath, as though the entire hall had begun to realize that what was happening could not be undone. You speak of order, the king said, his voice calm, but carrying with it a depth that reached beyond authority alone. Yet you fail to recognize what stands before you. His gaze moved across them, deliberate, unhurried, giving each person the space to feel the weight of his words without needing to raise his voice. No one answered. No one dared. Elena stood just behind him, her posture straighter than it had ever been, not because she was told to stand that way, but because something within her no longer bent under the weight of expectation. The wolf pup rose slowly to its small feet, unsteady at first, then stronger, its presence no longer fragile but quietly radiant in a way that drew attention without effort. A faint sound moved through the crowd, not quite a whisper, not quite disbelief, but something in between, as recognition began to spread, piece by piece, through those who had once refused to see. The king turned slightly, his attention returning to Elena, and in that moment, the distance between them felt entirely gone. You protected what was mine, he said, his voice lower now, meant for her, though it carried far enough for others to hear. The words settled deeply, not as praise, but as truth. Elena's heartbeat steadied, her gaze meeting his without hesitation, because she understood now, not completely, but enough. Enough to know that this moment was not chance. It was not accident. It was something that had been waiting, unseen, just as she had been. The king's expression did not change, but something in his eyes shifted, something resolute, something final. And now, he continued, his voice rising just enough to reach every corner of the hall, what is mine will not stand alone. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, heavy with the understanding that nothing within these walls would remain the same after this moment. And Elena, once unseen, once dismissed, stood at the center of it all, no longer hidden, no longer forgotten, but revealed in a way that could not be undone. No one moved when the words settled, not because they were ordered to remain still, but because something deeper held them there, something that had shifted beyond rules and expectations, into something far more absolute. Elena felt it in the quiet steadiness of her own breath, in the way the space around her no longer pressed inward but opened, as if the boundaries that once defined her place had dissolved without needing to be broken. The wolf pup stepped forward, its small frame no longer uncertain, its presence carrying a quiet certainty that drew every eye without effort. Its silver-threaded fur caught the candlelight in a way that could no longer be ignored, and the recognition that followed moved through the crowd like a slow awakening, hesitant at first, then undeniable. This was not something ordinary. This was not something to be dismissed. The king stood firm at the center of it all, his presence no longer just authority, but declaration, and when he turned, it was not to face the court as he had done countless times before, but to stand fully beside Elena, removing any final distance between them. The gesture was simple, but its meaning carried through the hall with a clarity no one could deny. "You have defined her by absence," he said, his voice calm, unwavering, each word placed with precision. "You measured her worth by what you believed she did not possess." The silence deepened, not in resistance, but in recognition, as though the truth had finally found a place to stand. Elena felt the weight of those words, not as something heavy, but as something that settled into her, something that reshaped the way she understood herself, not through their judgment, but through what had always been there, waiting to be seen. The king's gaze moved across the nobles one final time, not searching, not questioning, but certain. "But what you failed to see," he continued, "was never missing." A faint shift passed through the room, not loud, not disruptive, but real, as if something long held in place had finally begun to loosen. Elena stood taller without realizing it, her shoulders no longer drawn inward, her presence no longer something to hide. She did not need to step forward. She did not need to prove anything. She simply existed, and that was enough. The king turned to her then, his expression steady, resolute, and for a moment, the noise of the world faded once more, leaving only the quiet space between them. "From this moment," he said, his voice lower now, meant for her, but heard by all, "you will not stand outside of what was meant for you." The words settled into her, not as a promise, not as something distant, but as something immediate, something that had already begun. The wolf pup moved to her side, pressing gently against her leg, its presence warm, steady, a silent affirmation of everything that had been revealed. Around them, the court remained still, not in defiance, but in acceptance, because there was no longer anything to challenge, no illusion left to protect. The king's hand lifted slightly, not to command, but to mark the moment, to make it known. "Let it be understood," he said, his voice carrying once more through the vast hall.